as was mentioned, I grew up in Marin. Marin has always been a magnet for me, and the North Bay in particular. And Tim, you have traveled the entire world. You've lived all over the place, but the North Bay is where you call home. I'd love to know a little bit what brought you here and what keeps you here.
Sorry, hold it a bit further away. Well, firstly, it's great to be here. Finally on a lovely morning here in Northern California. I've been in Europe for the last 5 or 6 weeks, and I got back on Saturday, and the weather was worse here than it was in Scotland, which was a little disappointing. So it's great to see some blue sky and sunshine. And you know, it's funny. My wife and I moved to San Francisco in the late 80s, and I have two really abiding memories of the Bay Area from when we first arrived. One was wandering around North Beach in September with the light coming off the buildings like I'd never seen before, and thinking, oh boy, you know, if you're a visual person, this place is pretty special, because it's Mediterranean, you know, the bright light, it's just remarkable. But the other is having hiked up Mount Tam and sort of sitting on some edge somewhere, I can't quite remember where it was, but looking out over the bay and seeing how insignificant the city was compared to the mountains and the water, and realizing how unique this part of the world is in terms of the kind of interplay and between, you know, city and incredibly beautiful countryside. And so for me, that view of looking down from the North Bay at the bay is kind of iconic of the Bay Area. And so a few years ago, when we were looking, after having lived in Palo Alto for years and San Francisco, we were looking for somewhere to kind of get some real, you know, Bay Area countryside. We picked Glen Ellen, sort of by accident, although we did actually have some friends up there and have loved it, and we've been there full time for the last few years. And yeah, it's incredibly peaceful, beautiful, and yeah, nice part of the world to live.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what I'd like to do is kind of start by talking about design think and this concept that you came up with while you were at IDEO. I'd love to know a little bit more about the origins of that, how you've seen it be applied in today's world. But then I also want to kind of segue into your latest article around the AI dividend. And I know AI is a huge topic for everyone right now. And I'll preface with, when I read your article, it gave me this peace of mind and a feeling of a renaissance was around the corner of thought and creativity. And it shadowed some of those concerns I had around, will I have a job when AI figures out how to do banking? And will my children have jobs?
Yeah.
So I'd love to start with design think, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's nothing special about design thinking, really. It's what designers have done for a long time. What I was concerned with when we started to kind of talk about it and sort of try to, I don't know, describe what it is creative people do. And I was interested in doing that for two reasons. Firstly, because I think we have an overly biased approach to the world, which is essentially based on analytical thinking. Don't get me wrong. I mean, analytical thinking is incredibly powerful. Scientific method, incredibly powerful, which was a large part of what drove the last Renaissance. But it's not the only way we have of navigating through the world, right? And so you can very broadly describe analytical thinking as kind of hypothesis-driven thinking. We have this notion of what the world should be like, and we attempt to try and prove that it is that way, right? And that is really good in a search for truth. Aristotle wrote all about this quite a long time ago, when he really prefaced the idea of the scientific method. He didn't actually describe it as such, but in the search for truth, analytical thinking is incredibly powerful. But in the search for possibility, it's not quite so powerful, because when we're in the search for possibility, when we're trying to discover fundamentally new things, there is no single truth, and what there is the possibility of discovering new ideas. And so design thinking is essentially a discovery-driven process, right? And we just don't teach people in business how to use discovery-driven processes in innovation, in building relationships with our customers, and all the other places where it can be relevant. So that's what I was trying to do when we were talking about design thinking. Was describe what is essentially a discovery-driven process. You go out, you understand the world, you understand your customer or users, whoever you're interested in. You use that as an inspiration to drive insights that ultimately drive ideas. And then you go and test those ideas by building them, by making them. And you keep doing that over and over and over again until you get a solution that really works. It's very simple. It's essentially what design thinking is. And so it requires great observational skills. It requires the ability to see something and translate that into an idea, which means you have to have skills in visualization and in sort of making ideas real. And then it requires a bias towards action, a bias towards making stuff and seeing how successful that making is and being willing to go back and do it again and do it again and do it again until you get it right. My colleague and the founder of the D School at Stanford, David Kelly, talks about what the fundamental kind of character you need in order to be successful at design thinking is what he calls creative confidence, which is the ability to have new ideas and the confidence to act on them. Actually, it turns out that whole idea of creative confidence is quite similar to entrepreneurialism. You think about what entrepreneurs do is they have the ability to have an idea, but they have the confidence to act on that idea and keep acting on that idea until they've built something. So there's quite an interesting overlap between entrepreneurialism, creative confidence, and design thinking. Anyway, so focused, really tried to kind of get this idea out there for two reasons. Firstly, because I believe that business people could use design thinking based processes for tackling a much wider range of problems than just designing the next product or the next experience. You can use it for strategy. You can use it for the way you think about designing your organization. You use it for the way you might build brands. There are many, many ways of using design thinking, and I wanted to encourage business people, business leaders, to apply it in broader ways. I was also I ran a design company, IDEO, for 20 years, and I was interested in getting design as a kind of an activity further upstream in the kind of in the business hierarchy, if you like. I'd much prefer working with people who control businesses, which are the executives who run businesses, and so I wanted to get design to be thought of as a more strategic tool in leadership, which I think we did a decent job of.
I couldn't agree more. And in those 20 years when you were at IDEO, can you give us some examples of great success stories where you saw that transition from kind of traditional design to this design thinking and how that amplified or accelerated those clients you served?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways we saw it was we started having the opportunity to apply design to more kind of systemic problems than I guess that we would normally think of. Back in, I'm trying to remember the date now. I think it was probably around 2005, 6. I think it was. Business Week magazine, as it was then, did a front cover article on IDEO, and we talked a lot about the kinds of work we did and the way we thought, and it was the early days of describing what we thought design thinking was. And the most interesting response was we started getting calls from executives from totally different areas of business than we'd ever worked in before, who were saying, I think you might be able to help us solve a problem. One of those was somebody who ran a large hospital system in Minnesota, I think it was, who said, we have a real problem with the way our kind of emergency room works. And we have a lot of dissatisfied customers, and we have a lot of unhappy doctors and nurses and technicians, and we think that might be a design problem. Can you come and help us? And so starting to apply design to these more complex systemic processes was something, there was a transition or transformation that we've seen, and now that's most of what IDEO works on. And some of those have been really quite exciting. So for instance, some years ago, more than a decade ago now, we were approached by the CEO of a company in Peru, of all places. It took him a while to persuade us that he was serious, but he'd grown up here in the Bay Area. He'd moved back to Peru with his father, who'd unfortunately died quite soon afterwards, but they had bought the 32nd biggest bank out of 32 in Peru. And by the way, it's now the biggest bank in Peru by far, and it's one of the biggest companies in Peru. This guy, Carlos Rodriguez Pastor, had incredible vision. He went to Berkeley, if there are any Berkeley grads in the room. And he still comes and watches the Warriors play. But he approached us to say, I think we have a real problem in Peru. Our education system is last in the PISA rankings. If I'm going to build my company, I need customers and I need employees. They need to be educated. I want to build an education system. So he asked us to help him design what was a private education system for kids, but it was $150 a month. It's a lot less, a tenth of what we spend on kids here in our public school system. And started off with one school. It's now got, I think, more than 80 schools in Peru, also in Mexico, in Ecuador, in Colombia. And it tripled the literacy scores for kids in school, doubled the math scores, and it was all based around kind of fundamental principles of design thinking. So projects like that, I mean, we now have graduates from that school system at all of the top universities in the world. And so being able to work on those kinds of problems by helping leaders see where design might be relevant was hugely rewarding.
It's amazing. And I think as we start to kind of transition to where we are today, I think the question always comes to mind is, how have you seen in your career the types of issues we faced a decade ago, 2 decades ago? How are those issues different from what we currently face today?
Well, I mean, if you want to, I mean, my career has pretty much spanned the kind of computer revolution, I guess. I started off, my first job when I joined what was the precursor to IDEO, before IDEO existed, was to buy our first Macintosh computers. And I left design school just as the first CAD systems were being created. And most of the work that I did in the early part of my career was with tech companies like Apple and Microsoft in this country, and companies like Sony and Epson and other Japanese technology companies. That's where I did most of my work, first decade or so. And we've been seeing this steady rolling transformation of everything that's been driven by computing. But I think what we're seeing right now with AI, and I mean, large language models are only one version of AI. We've been talking about AI for 30 or 40 years, well, in fact, longer actually. But the acceleration of change that's creating is, I think, a sort of a transformation that's every bit as great as the Industrial Revolution was in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And actually, and interestingly enough, almost all of professional design emerged out of the Industrial Revolution. Right? It didn't really exist, but other than architecture, design as a profession, in product design, graphic design, none of these things existed before the Industrial Revolution. They were all a response to the Industrial Revolution. So it makes me wonder what forms of design are going to be a response to AI. But I genuinely think that we're going through as significant a shift. And therefore, the future is every bit as unknowable and foggy as it was if you were working on a farm, as most people were, in the mid-1700s, whether it's here in the US or in Europe or anywhere else. Right? How could you possibly imagine what was going to happen over the next 100, 150 years? I feel like we're in a similar kind of place.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you also started your career working on fax machines, so I'm very glad you pivoted from that.
It's funny, you're right. Well done for spotting that one. Yes, the first project, well, kind of one of the first projects I did was to design a fax machine. And I mean, you have to be beyond, I mean, there are some people in this room who are old enough to remember what fax machines were, yeah? And my kids had no idea what a fax machine was, and they're in their 30s now. So yes, it was a fairly redundant piece of technology, and that's one of the things we have to be always a little wary of when we talk about the latest technology. I mean, that back then, that was the latest technological revolution. I mean, the idea that you could transfer images between places didn't exist before that, right? And then, of course, rapidly after that, we had desktop publishing and the Mac and everything else, which made that even easier. But we have to be a little careful about assuming the latest technology is the thing that's going to change everything. Most of them are transitional, but I think now we're starting to see what all of those transitions might add up to.
And on that note, and as we kind of transition to your latest article, and I highly encourage everyone to read it, the AI dividend is fascinating. And in the beginning of the article, you bring up this concept that is very near and dear to me around surplus, let me make sure I get it right, surplus human bandwidth. Having 2 kids under 4 and a wife that's an executive at the bank, I'm very interested in that bandwidth.
Well, you know, the whole thesis of the article is that, you know, we're focusing a lot at the moment on the power that AI brings in terms of creating efficiency. Right? And you know, whether it's automating roles or increasing the speed of things, whatever it might be. But if we look back at every major innovation that's produced efficiency, every one of those innovations has essentially been commoditizing, because everybody learns how to do the same thing. Right? Everybody eventually gets access to that efficiency. Now, once it used to take large amounts of capital to get access to that efficiency. So back in the Industrial Revolution, steam engines, for instance, were incredibly expensive. And so only people with access to capital could build factories. But AI, in comparison, is incredibly cheap, and we all get access to it. So it will be more rapidly commoditizing than the factories of the 18th and 19th century were. What it will do, as it creates more and more efficiency, is to create enormous amounts of human bandwidth. Right? There are things that we spend large amounts of our time today, particularly coordination. I mean, something approaching 50 to 60% of all the activity in large companies is to do with coordination, not value creation at all. So if you think about most of that bandwidth becoming available, because what AI is really good at is coordination, what are we going to do with it? Are we just going to like assume nobody's going to do anything with it, and we're just going to let all those people go, and we're all going to be sitting around on the beach somewhere? I don't believe it. And in fact, even if you did do that, you would find yourself as a company in a position where you can't compete, because you can be as fast and as efficient as everybody else, but that's all you can be. And so that's a race to the bottom. The companies that are going to succeed are the ones that figure out what to do with that bandwidth. And I believe it will that bandwidth, and we call it the AI dividend, because what do you do with dividends? You invest them. You invest dividends in the future. And we believe that organizations that invest that human dividend, that bandwidth dividend in the future, particularly in the ability for their organization to adapt, will be the ones that are successful. They will have better ideas, they'll have bigger ideas, they'll have more ideas. They will create distinctive innovations. They will build more valuable brands. They will build deeper customer relationships, all the things that lead to success in business, by investing that dividend somehow.
There was another line that was great, where you talked about weight loss without exercise. And I know that wasn't the point you were trying to make, much to my disappointment. But can you walk me through kind of that idea of the fitness and what the byproduct is in all of this work that can be done?
I mean, the analogy is simple. I mean, you know, we now have the technology, right? We can lose weight just by taking an injection. Wonderful, wonderful technology. But if it's all you do, you don't actually get any healthier. What you have to also do is focus on exercise and fitness and your diet. And apart from anything else, if you don't do that, then you lose muscle mass, and you end up actually becoming less fit as you get lighter. But if you invest in fitness, you find you've now got the ability to do things you couldn't do before physically, and it becomes a compounding advantage. You lose weight, you work on fitness, you get healthier and healthier, you get fitter and fitter, and you can do more and more in your life, and that gives you more energy, and that makes you fitter, and things get better and better and better. It's a kind of it's a positive sum cycle, right? And I believe the same thing about business, right? If you invest the dividend in creativity, in the kind of human qualities that your people have, the talent they have, that I believe that your organization and this idea of becoming more and more adaptive, that your organization will just get fitter and fitter and fitter as it gets lighter, as it gets more efficient, if you like.
And I know we're in a room full of leaders, and I've got to ask the question because I love this concept. The leaders in the time of kind of the belt and shaft factory were appropriately engineers. You yourself were an engineer. But in the article, AI Dividend, you bring up this concept of the gardener. Can you walk through a little bit of what the gardener is?
Yeah. I mean, I believed in the concept of the gardener, or the metaphor of the gardener as a leader, for a long time, even before we were talking about the AI dividend, because I've always believed that the context which you create in your organization has an enormous impact on what that organization can do. We often call that context culture, but it's culture with a big C, if you like. It's everything that creates context for the people that are working in your organization and with your organization, your customers, your suppliers, whatever. And the great leaders that I've worked with have always spent as much, if not more, time thinking about how to set that context, just like a gardener does. What a gardener does is they can't actually grow the plants, right? The plants grow themselves. What they can do is they can make sure the soil's healthy. They can make sure the right nutrients and water and sunlight are provided. They can weed, take out the things that are competing with the plants, and then they can harvest and perhaps introduce new plants when necessary. They're essentially creating this ecosystem. And I've always believed, and I've seen the best leaders that I've ever worked with have always invested a lot of time on that. It's just, I think in the future that will become absolutely essential. And the reason for that is the other form of leadership, which is, we refer to as kind of the engineering mindset, which is one based on the idea of control, was designed based on the idea of hierarchy, right? And so our organization models today, which are hierarchical models, were designed, again, 100 years ago, to move information around an organization, to create reliability. Because the only way we could move information around an organization was through hierarchy, through layers of management. But we now have technology that doesn't need hierarchy to move information around. We can use agents to move information around. And so now you don't need lots of hierarchy. You can have lots of semi-autonomous teams. And what we're seeing, I mean, we've seen leading organizations do this for a while. It's really hard. I mean, Jeff Bezos was talking about 2-pizza teams 20 years ago, right? But most of the fastest moving organizations today rely on lots and lots and lots of teams working in parallel, but highly coordinated. Now we don't need to use a hierarchy to create that high levels of coordination. We can use agents to do it. We can use other software tools to do it. And so you won't be able to control everything in that environment, right? You can't possibly know enough. Even with all what it requires is creating the information environment that those teams can control themselves. Stan McChrystal, who ran the special forces during the Afghanistan-Iran-Iraq war, came up with this concept. He called it Team of Teams. I don't know if anybody's ever read his book, but it's essentially the same idea. And what he used to run special forces then, which had hundreds of different agencies involved, was this same concept of lots and lots and lots of highly networked small teams. And so the way you lead in that environment is to lead like a gardener, not like an engineer.
And I know we're starting to come up on time here. As you think about what's going to differentiate companies and leaders moving forward? What advice would you have for a room full of leaders today?
I think what'll differentiate leaders will be the same thing that's going to differentiate organizations, which is investing whatever additional bandwidth they get in things which are genuinely value creating. I think a lot of that will come from creativity. I think a lot of that will come from the ability to have new ideas, choose new directions, run new experiments. I mean, I found I've gone through my own experience of kind of getting rid of all of the kind of hierarchical, coordination-based kind of work that I used to do, because I don't run a company anymore. When I ran a company, I was doing that all the time. And so now I have genuinely large blocks of time to focus on things. And it's so liberating. I mean, the quality of my ideas now compared to, a few years ago when I was running from one 30-minute meeting to the next 30-minute meeting and jumping on a plane and going to some other part of the world, the quality of my ideas is so much higher than it was. And I think leaders need to search for the bandwidth for each of us to have those kinds of quality ideas. I spent a bit of time working with Stefan Bancel, who's the CEO of Moderna, interesting company. But one thing that I was impressed with him was that every other Saturday morning, he would spend the whole morning just reflecting, just thinking about what had happened over the last 2 weeks. I don't think most of us take time to do that. And it's a good example of investing bandwidth. I mean, he was creating it on a Saturday morning, but creating bandwidth in giving himself time to think. I believe that successful leaders will be investing their bandwidth in giving themselves time to think.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I've learned a lot. I think where we're on this precipice of AI and when efficiency becomes the table stakes, it's all going to be about figuring out what do you do with that, how do you take it to the next level to truly build something that lasts. So thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.